Hey, it's Christian with St. Augustine TV. When you think about museums in St. Augustine, what comes to mind? Forts? Pirates? Spanish explorers? Maybe Henry Flagler? Well, there's a new museum on St. George Street, and it contains something a little different. Original pieces of history. And some of them are absolutely incredible. Welcome to the new Karpeles Manuscript Library Museum. If you're walking down St. George Street, you could very easily miss it. You're surrounded by restaurants, shops, souvenirs, ice cream. And then you walk through this door, and suddenly you're looking at documents that were written by people who actually lived through the events you read in history books. That's what makes Karpeles so interesting. It's not primarily about looking at objects that are related to history. It's about looking at the actual stuff people wrote, signed, drew, and created. We're talking letters, maps, treaties, manuscripts, music, political documents, and other pieces of historical record. The Karpeles Manuscript Library was founded by David and Marcia Karpeles in 1983. David had a somewhat unusual hobby. He collected historical manuscripts. Then he kept collecting them, and collecting them, and collecting them, until the collection grew to more than 1 million historical documents. We're talking about material covering literature, science, religion, political history, exploration, music, and art. And right now, for America's 250th, there are founding and related documents prominently on display. And instead of keeping everything locked away for private viewing, the Karpeles family created museums where ordinary people could actually see pieces of history. And here's the really cool part. Admission is totally free. Every Karpeles museum is free to visit. There's another thing that makes Karpeles a little different. They rotate their collection between their 3 museums. According to Karpeles, exhibits are rotated about 3 times a year. So if you come back later, you might see an entirely different piece of history. This new St. Augustine Museum is located at 105 St. George Street, right in the middle of historic downtown. Because if there's one city in America where people are already walking around thinking about history, it's this one. One of the things I like about manuscripts is that they change the way you think about history. We tend to experience history as a story. George Washington did this. The revolution happened. Somebody wrote something. Somebody signed something. And then we move on. But when you see an actual document, the whole thing becomes more tangible. Somebody actually sat down and wrote this. They held the pen. They made the decisions. They had no idea that hundreds of years later, somebody would be standing here staring at their handwriting. That's pretty amazing. Now, if you're expecting nothing but dusty old pieces of paper, don't. Because the Karpeles collection gets surprisingly eclectic, even a little weird. The collection can include everything from presidential signatures and colonial maps to leaves from the Gutenberg Bible. And then you might turn around and find something completely unexpected, like an original Star Trek costume, or Disney animation artwork, or dinosaur eggs. I dig that about this place. I think an interesting thing about this museum isn't simply that it has rare things. St. Augustine has plenty of rare things. It's the idea behind the museum. David and Marcia Karpeles wanted their collection to encourage curiosity, learning, and literacy, as well as being good stewards. And they deliberately established museums in communities where people could easily access the collection. That's a lovely philosophy. Instead of saying, this belongs in a major museum in New York or Washington, they're saying, let's bring it to the people. And St. Augustine is now one of those places. Again, it's totally free, and I think that's worth emphasizing. You can spend an afternoon walking around downtown St. Augustine and spend a small fortune. But you can walk into Karpeles, see historical documents that may be hundreds of years old, and it doesn't cost you anything. Now that's a good deal. So is Karpeles worth adding to your St. Augustine itinerary? Absolutely. Especially if you're interested in history, But even if you're not, it's worth checking out. You never really know what you're going to find. And that's probably the best thing about this museum. You could walk in expecting a bunch of old documents and walk out having seen something you didn't even know existed. And that's what makes a good museum. It makes you curious. So the next time you're walking down St. George Street, look past the souvenirs, look past the t-shirts, and look for 105 St. George Street. Because behind that door is a part of a collection containing more than 1 million pieces of history. And you can walk in and see it for free. This has been Christian with St. Augustine TV, and we're going to keep finding interesting places in St. Augustine hiding in plain sight. We'll see you next time. Hey, thanks for watching. For more local history and content, don't forget to like and subscribe.